반갑습니다. 먼저 바쁘신 일정에도 서울 ESG 경영 국제 포럼에 참석해 주신 폴 제퍼리스 박사님께 감사 말씀을 드립니다. 박사님께서 계신 캠브리지 대학교 휴즈월 기후 참여 센터 소장이시며 그리고 영국 정부의 넷제로 허브 의장이신데요. 박사님이 소속하고 계시는 캠브리지 대학교 휴즈월 기후 참여 센터에 대해서 간단한 소개 부탁드리겠습니다.
Well, first let me thank the Seoul Institute and the Seoul Metropolitan Council for inviting me and giving me the opportunity to speak at the ESG forum yesterday. It was a great honor and a great pleasure to do that. Yes, I am the director of the Centre for Climate Engagement at Hughes Hall. That is a college within the University of Cambridge. And we have a small team, maybe 10 or 12 people at the centre. And what we do is to take academic research, working with the faculty in the college, elsewhere in the university, and elsewhere in the country and around the world. We take academic research primarily in the fields of climate law, climate governance, and climate policy, and we translate it, we convert it into a format, into tools and materials that real-world decision makers can use. And those decision makers can be in the private sector, they can be in business, finance, the legal profession, the professional legal profession rather than the academic legal profession. But we also translate for governments, both for central government, but particularly for local government, including cities, and particularly the city of Cambridge. And in fact, we have one major program focused on understanding what we call the locally determined contribution, what the local authority or the city can do to contribute to the national targets, but also to understand how the national targets and the local targets interact with each other, how they can be mutually reinforcing rather than conflicting. So that's what we do at the centre. I have a second role, which is also very relevant to the topic we discussed. I'm chair of something called the Net Zero Hub for Greater South East England. And that is a central government agency. It is sponsored and funded by the Department for, or the Ministry for Energy Security and Net Zero. And we are funded to help local authorities, including cities, to make the transition to net zero. And we do that through a combination of grants and funding, support programs, training, ways of helping local authorities understand the policies, opportunities and business models for accelerating the transition to net zero. And probably the most important city that we work with is London itself, because we are the South East England Net Zero Hub. Well, let me start by explaining why I think ESG is important for cities. I think it's important because cities are definitely part of the problem. They contribute about 2/3 of energy use globally, but they also contribute even more, about 70% of global greenhouse gas emissions. So cities need to mitigate their emissions, they need to reduce their emissions. But cities are also a victim of the problem. Cities are vulnerable. By 2050, it's estimated that about 70% of the global population will live in cities. And already in the last 35 years, the percentage of poor and vulnerable population within cities has increased by over 300%. So it's a growing problem, if you like. Already about 30% of the global population lives within 50 kilometers of the sea. And by 2050, it's estimated that something approaching 1 billion people will be at risk of sea level rise. So cities are vulnerable and they need to develop resilience. But the final reason why cities are important to ESG is that they can be and must be part of the solution. And that's partly because cities account for about 80% of global GDP, so a very significant contribution. But they are also centres of various kinds of power, certainly government and political power, but also business and investment, but also cultural and intellectual influence, the home of innovation, of research and development, of the universities. So cities definitely have the potential to be part of the solution. Moving on to how ESG and cities are relevant together and how they interact and can be mutually reinforcing. I think the primary reason is that both cities and an ESG approach are ecosystem approaches. They're certainly system approaches, but I think more particularly they're a kind of an ecosystem approach in which, if you like, all the parts are integrated, interactive, interdependent, and also dependent. And all the parts are mutually reinforcing. Each part amplifies and contributes to the other part. And so the combination of all of the parts, because of the integration and the mutual reinforcing, means that the whole is, if you like, greater than the sum of the parts. And the final reason why I think cities are a particularly good fit for ESG is that they're just the right size. Countries can be too big, too fragmented, too diverse, too different to easily manage through an ESG lens. Villages and towns can be managed through an ESG lens, but they're too small to have a global impact. And cities are right in the middle, just the right size to be managed holistically through an ESG systematic approach. But they're also big enough to have an impact that is significant globally, especially if they can act as, if you like, an exemplar, a leader, a case study for other cities to copy. Yes, I think that competitiveness in cities needs to be carefully thought about and understood perhaps a little bit differently from the way competitiveness is traditionally understood in a business context. I think in a business context, certainly the emphasis or the focus is on financial success. And for that reason, the metrics of competitiveness and success in businesses are generally associated with the value to shareholders and normally seen through the lens of profitability. But in the case of cities, we're not talking about the private sector, we're talking about the public interest. And the public interest is much wider. It certainly includes the economy, I think, but it's not limited to the economy. It includes the environment, it includes community and society, and it certainly includes governance. And so in the case of the public sector, I think the primary metric, instead of being shareholder value, could be seen as stakeholder value, the broader set of stakeholders, and in the case of cities, in particular, citizen value. So when it comes to defining what we mean by urban competitiveness, I think it is all of the things to do with community, environment, governance, and the economy that attract both businesses and people to be in a particular place, a particular city. And for that reason, I would say that the kind of key metric for city competitiveness is something like livability or quality of life, or even happiness. I think that's a better way of defining whether a city is competitive. And I think it's true to say that we're seeing more and more recognition of that among the great cities of the world, including Seoul, who are all competing now to be seen as the world's most livable city, the city where people are happiest for a variety of reasons. Thank you. So the concept of ESG, environment, social and governance, was originally developed in a private sector context where it was intended as a risk identification and management tool for non-financial risks. And for that reason, in a private sector context, ESG didn't originally include the concept of economy. I think if we are going to apply the concept of ESG to the public sector generally, and particularly to cities, I think we have to bring in the concept of economy as well. In a public sector context, the traditional way of looking at things has been through the lens of sustainability, which does include the economy alongside social and environmental issues, but doesn't generally include the governance element that is included in ESG. So when it comes to cities or the public sector more generally, I like to think of a concept that includes all four elements. So environment, social, governance, and economy. And the reason why I think it's important to bring the economy into the public sector or the cities equation is that it's impossible to think that sustainability, environment, social and governance can be delivered without including a focus on the economy. Because for a city, like a family and a household, it's important to generate income, in particularly through jobs and employment, in order to be able to pay for everything else. And in the case of a family, that is the income from a job. In the case of a city, it is the tax revenue from the citizens of the city. And so I think it's important in the case of cities to focus on the economy as well, particularly through the lens of jobs and employment. And in the context of ESG, I think it's helpful if those jobs can be located within the city itself. First of all, to reduce travel and commuting, ideally within walking distance, but not necessarily. Ideally, those jobs should be created now in sustainable sectors, clean tech, fintech, climate tech, renewable energy, and so on. But there will always be a need for manufacturing as well. So where manufacturing is needed, I think it's sensible to locate those kinds of activities in enterprise zones that are suitable for manufacturing, particularly areas where there are good transport links, transport hubs, especially ports, to create the opportunity for overseas export. I think there is also an opportunity for cities to foster a sustainable economy by introducing industrial clusters. And there are examples in Europe, in Rotterdam, the port of Rotterdam in the Netherlands, and Teesside in the UK, where activities that generate heat or generate energy or generate emissions that would otherwise be wasted or go into the atmosphere are actually used by other industries that are close by. And so you have a circular economy effect where waste resources are used. So I think those are some of the things that a city can focus on doing. But to do all of those things, I think cities also need to develop a sort of an ecosystem of supporting services and activities to enable the new industries to move forward. Some of those will be to do with introducing incubators and accelerators to accelerate the progress of new technologies and businesses to the market. I think some of that support will be in the form of developing supply chains, new supply chains for new businesses, computer chips and so on. And also supply chain logistics, how to move things around to get them in the right place at the right time. I think there needs to be knowledge transfer, sharing of best practice to improve the speed at which learning is propagated around the economy. I think there needs to be an emphasis on building institutional capacity for some of the new businesses, but also introducing skills training, because the kinds of skills needed for some of the new businesses are different from traditional job skills. And then I think there is a need for underpinning innovation, research, development to bring new ideas. And all of these things can be done either in traditional centres like universities or new innovation hubs where many knowledge companies are brought together, as is happening all around the world, certainly in Cambridge where I am from. But also an idea that is, if you like, more sustainable. Instead of building new places to do research and innovation, a concept of virtual centres of excellence where people share and interact on the internet rather than in real time and place. Yes, Copenhagen is a very interesting example where they have taken a slightly different perspective on ESG, I think, particularly by emphasizing the cultural and the social part of ESG and applying that to the economic part, if you like. And they've done that in two or three different ways. One way is to focus on what you might call the co-creation of the direction of travel, of the vision for the city. And by co-creation, I mean that they have worked very actively with the citizens of Copenhagen to develop the targets and the ambition for the city. So it's very much a shared objective between the governance and the citizens and the city itself. The second thing they've done in this direction is to focus not only on environmental objectives, which is often the case with ESG. They've been very explicit in focusing on social objectives as well. So, for example, they have a target for a 20% increase in the use of shared urban space. They have a target for 90% of the citizens of Copenhagen to believe that their city is lively, vibrant, cosmopolitan. And they have a target for 75% of citizens to see Copenhagen as a green city. So they brought the people into the equation very strongly. And then the third thing I would say is that they've emphasized something that I think they call the socialization of innovation. And again, it's part of the same pattern of bringing people together, bringing companies together, bringing thought leaders together in these kind of virtual and physical innovation hubs. And there is one in particular called, I think, the Blocks Hub, where I think there are 350 organizations working together, really to generate new ideas, new technologies, new businesses, all focused on sort of developing the city as an ESG leader. And it's been very successful in making Copenhagen regarded now as one of the world's leading ESG practitioners. In terms of what that could mean for Seoul and either the bike scheme or any other scheme, I haven't had a chance to think about that very much. But what I would say is, first of all, I would go to the citizenry and have some very clear, try to find some clear answers as to what the users of the system experience is, to get feedback to improve it. I mean, ideally, I think for a system like that, it would be initially introduced on the basis of co-creating with the citizens, what do they want? What do they need? Or when they go to work, when they go shopping, when they undertake recreation and leisure, what is the element of transport that is missing? How can a bike sharing scheme contribute to that? In terms of how the Copenhagen experience might be relevant for Seoul, I haven't thought about this very much, but it seems to me in the case, for example, of the shared bike scheme, it would be a good idea right at the start of the scheme to consult with citizens about what it is they need, whether from a bike scheme or from transport more generally, first to see if a bike scheme is the right answer, and if it is the right answer, how it should be structured, how it should be made available, so that in a very real sense, the city is co-creating a scheme with the citizens. If that wasn't done, and it probably was done to some extent, I don't know, but certainly as time goes on, work with the citizens to get feedback, to learn what works, what doesn't work, and how the system can be improved. But more fundamentally, to embed the scheme as part of the cultural thinking, to make it not just best practice, but normal practice. I think, again, co-creating shared objectives around what it is that the scheme is trying to achieve. Is it half of the population to use bikes for every single journey? Is there a time limit on that, and so on? I think another possible element could be to make sure that certainly all the information that citizens need to be able to use the system most effectively is readily available in real time, so that people don't have to search for that information, but they can find it easily, where the bikes are, how many there are, where they can take them back to. And then finally, to have probably some kind of dashboard that shows citizens the performance of the scheme. You know, how many people are using the scheme, how many emissions that has saved, how many emissions are saved by each journey, those kinds of things, to give positive reinforcement so that it becomes part of everyday thinking. Yes, I chose Boston as a case study because I lived there for many years, so I'm familiar with the city. I studied at Harvard University, so I have an affinity to the place. Boston is just one of several examples, including places like San Francisco and Cambridge, which I know quite well, that has done what I recommended before, to focus economic development on sustainable industries, particularly clean tech, fintech, climate tech, to some extent renewable energy. In Boston's case, there has been a focus on health, biotech and education, as well as climate change. But the first thing I would say is that what they've done is create that ecosystem of supporting activities and services that enable new businesses and industries to take off. So ensuring that there is, if you like, a pipeline of talent, you know, the right skills are being developed, that there is a network of professional and financial services available to support the new businesses of the future. Boston's focus on climate change has been very deliberate and supported through a very specific program, the Green New Deal, which has a number of specific elements tailored to Boston's particular situation. For example, it has a green retrofit program to improve the energy performance of old buildings, because Boston is an old city with many old buildings, and you know, they can't quickly replace those buildings, so retrofit is an important part of what they're doing. They're trialling a fare-free public transport system because, you know, Boston is quite a dense, compact city in its center. The roads can easily become congested. They are actively trying to shift people from cars into public transport, and one obvious way of doing that is trialing at least fare-free public transport systems. Although Boston does have many parks, it is a very urban city, and they are introducing an urban tree canopy program, which is another part of what they are doing. One interesting thing that they are experimenting with is the idea of the green dashboard that I mentioned for the Seoul bike scheme, where information about the performance of the city from an ESG point of view can be tracked by citizens in real time. So all of these elements part of the Green Deal. They've also made sensible and careful use of federal funding, for example, for the Climate Workforce Alliance, and that is a program designed specifically to train people in the new skills that will be needed for the new climate-focused businesses and technologies that the city is developing. The final point I'd make about Boston is that it is home to some of the world's great universities, particularly Harvard and MIT, but also Tufts and Boston University and others. And they have been able to act as a very important kind of base for the generation of fundamental research, new ideas, innovation, and have supported the city in that way. And I think Boston is a living example. It now tops Savills index of clean tech cities. And it's an example showing that in the case of cities, ESG in the round, including an emphasis on the economy, is very consistent and compatible with the other parts of ESG, with the environment, social and governance. They all work together very effectively to make sure that the city's economy and its sustainability are working in tandem. In terms of the lessons for Seoul, I think they are reasonably clear. The same kinds of things, a focus on using the research facilities that already exist in Seoul, the existing university system to support research and innovation, to having very clear targets, and not just targets, but also policies, as in the Green Deal, to support them. I think ensuring that there is an emphasis in particular on developing the ecosystem of support services, and in particular, I think, training and skills development for new businesses.
마지막으로 한 가지 더 여쭙고자 합니다. 서울은 이미 10분 도시라는 미래 비전을 추진하고 있는데요. 서울이 글로벌 ESG 선도 도시로 자기매김하기 위해서는 어떤 부분을 가장 중점적으로 추진해야 된다고 생각하십니까?
So, yes, thank you. I think I would place emphasis on the two aspects of ESG that really focus on people. First of all, the social component of ESG, because at the end of the day, I think the success of ESG is ultimately cultural. It's to do with people making connections with place, with the city of Seoul in this case. And I think that is partly because cities already exist as physically bounded spaces that people identify with. And that's because cities, including Seoul, already have a cultural identity. There are festivals, there are language, accents, dance, music, sports teams associated with Seoul. So you think, I am a Seoulite. And I saw a sign saying, Seoul, my soul. So that feeling already exists. And Seoul has a physical distinctive appearance. It has buildings and streets and parks and a skyline that the citizens of Seoul know and love. And I think those things can be taken and amplified through ESG, because ESG is an approach that I think is self-reinforcing. It is self-perpetuating and self-accelerating, that if people experience, understand and see the benefits of ESG, then they want more, and it becomes culturally absorbed into the life of the city. So that is one emphasis I would place. I would also place an emphasis on the other part of ESG that for me is about people, and that is governance, because governance is for people and it is by people. In this case, you could say it's in a political context rather than a cultural context. But at the end of the day, governance is for people, and people's needs are are many. They are holistic, they are multiple, they are for now and for the future, and they're connected needs, they're not separate. And for that reason, I think a focus on ESG in the context of governance is a very powerful way to move forward, because ESG is all of those things. You know, it is about multiple needs, not just one need. It is about needs for now and for the future. And because all of those needs can be integrated and mutually reinforcing in a way that, as I say, amplifies and escalates and strengthens for the future.